Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, cottagers. Welcome in, welcome in. I'm sorry I'm a little bit late today. I was getting things set up, and also I was napping, so bit of the usual, bit of, actually doing things. Well, hope everyone's having a good week. Happy Halloween, happy Thursday. I hope everything is good by you. Well, welcome in, Mary and Callio. I hope you get a good rest, but welcome in, welcome in. So, today, we're going to be doing a bit of a, quieter time. I'm going to turn down my music even a little bit more. Let's try like that. So we're going to be doing some reading of ghostly tales. I will try and not interrupt too much, so that we can kind of, move at a fairly good pace. The books that we're going to be reading from are on Project Gutenberg, so they are quite old. Yeah, but I thought it'd be nice to read some older ghostly tales. They shouldn't be too scary, I think, for a modern audience. Last year we read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in a similar vein, so hopefully it's a good time. It was nice and cozy last year. I appreciated that. Let me just take a quick look at my one Tama. He grew legs today, so I want to make sure that he is fed and happy. I think he is. Let me look at my other one really quick and make sure that he is alive and well, and then we can get into our first tale of the night, which I quickly read when I was scoping out some decent books. There's a lot of anthologies of ghost stories on Project Gutenberg, but the quality of some of them is certainly dubious. There's a lot of ghost stories from other countries written by mainly Europeans who don't speak the language, which is not great in my mind. So I tried to find some in-between ground. I did pick up the Lafcadio Hearn Kaidan stories from Japan because I do own that book, but we'll see what we read in there. The first one that we're going to be reading today is from an anthology called Famous Modern Ghost Stories, selected with an introduction by Dorothy Scarborough, PhD. She was a lecturer in English at Columbia University, and this was first published in 1921. Poe is always an option. True, Poe is there as well. Well, welcome in, Ray. Hope you're doing well. So, the very first story is called The Shadows on the Wall by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. And I believe this is from a book of hers called The Wind in the Rose Bush. Bedtime story for B. Welcome in, B. Welcome in. Yes. Hopefully not a too scary bedtime story. Alright. The Shadows on the Wall. Henry had words with Edward in the study the night before Edward died, said Caroline Glynn. She spoke not with acrimony, but with grave severity. Rebecca Ann Glynn gasped by way of assent. She sat in a wide flounce of black silk in the corner of the sofa and rolled terrified eyes from her sister Caroline to her sister Mrs. Stephen Brigham, who had been Emma Glynn, the one beauty of the family. The latter was beautiful still. With a large, splendid, full-blown beauty, she filled a great rocking chair with her superb bulk of femininity and swayed gently back and forth, her black silks whispering and her black frills fluttering. Even the shock of death, for her brother Edward lay dead in the house, could not disturb her outward serenity of demeanor. But even her expression of masterly placidity changed before her sister Caroline's announcement, and her sister Rebecca Ann's gasp of terror and distress in response. I think Henry might have controlled his temper when poor Edward was so near his end, she said with an asperity which disturbed slightly the roseate curves of her beautiful mouth. Of course he did not know, murmured Rebecca Ann in a faint tone. Of course he did not know it, said Caroline quickly. She turned on her sister with a strange, sharp look of suspicion. Then she shrank, as if from the other's possible answer. Rebecca gasped again. The married sister, Mrs. Emma Brigham, was now sitting up straight in her chair. She had ceased rocking, and was eyeing them both intently, with a sudden accentuation of family likeness in her face. "What do you mean?" said she impartially to them both. Then she, too, seemed to shrink before a possible answer. She even laughed an evasive sort of laugh. "Nobody means anything," said Caroline firmly. She rose and crossed the room toward the door with grim decisiveness. "Where are you going?" asked Mrs. Brigham. "I have something to see to," replied Caroline, and the others at once knew by her tone that she had some solemn and sad duty to perform in the chamber of death. "Oh," said Mrs. Brigham. After the door had closed behind Caroline, she turned to Rebecca. "Did Henry have many words with him?" she asked. "They were talking very loud," replied Rebecca evasively. Mrs. Brigham looked at her. She had not resumed rocking. She sat still, up straight, with a slight knitting of intensity on her fair forehead between the pretty rippling curves of her auburn hair. "Did you ever hear anything?" she asked in a low voice with a glance toward the door. "I was just across the hall in the south parlor, and the door was open and this door ajar," replied Rebecca with a slight flush. "Then you must have—" "I couldn't help it." "Everything?" "Most of it." "What was it?" "The old story." "I suppose Henry was mad, as he always was, because Edward was living on here for nothing, when he had wasted all the money father left him." Rebecca nodded, with a fearful glance at the door. When Emma spoke again, her voice was still more hushed. "I know how he felt," said she. "It must have looked as if Edward was living at his expense, but he wasn't. No, he wasn't. And Edward had a right here according to the terms of father's will, and Henry ought to have remembered it. Yes, he ought." "Did he say hard things?" "Pretty hard, from what I heard." "What?" "I heard him tell Edward that he had no business here at all, and he thought he had better go away." "What did Edward say?" "That he would stay here as long as he lived, and afterward, too, if he was a mind to, and he would like to see Henry get him out, and then—" "What?" "Then he laughed." "What did Henry say?" "I didn't hear him say anything, but—" "But what?" "I saw him when he came out of this room." "He looked mad?" "You've seen him when he looked so." Emma nodded. The expression of horror on her face had deepened. "Do you remember that time he killed the cat because she scratched him?" "Yes." "Don't!" Then Caroline re-entered the room. She went up to the stove, in which a wood fire was burning. It was a cold, gloomy day of fall, and she warmed her hands, which were reddened from recent washing in cold water. Mrs. Brigham looked at her and hesitated. She glanced at the door, which was still ajar. It did not easily shut, being still swollen with the damp weather of the summer. She rose and pushed it together with a sharp thud, which jarred the house. Rebecca started painfully with a half-exclamation. Caroline looked at her disapprovingly. "It is time you controlled your nerves, Rebecca," she said. Mrs. Brigham, returning from the closed door, said imperiously that it ought to be fixed. It shut so hard. "It will shrink enough after we have had the fire a few days," replied Caroline. "I think Henry ought to be ashamed of himself for talking as he did to Edward," said Mrs. Brigham abruptly, in an almost inaudible voice. "Hush," said Caroline, with a glance of actual fear at the closed door. "Nobody can hear with the door shut. I say again, I think Henry ought to be ashamed of himself. I shouldn't think he'd ever get over it, having words with poor Edward the very night before he died. Edward was enough sight better disposition than Henry, with all his faults. I never heard him speak a cross word, unless he spoke cross to Henry that last night. I don't know, but he did from what Rebecca overheard. Not so much cross as sort of soft and sweet and aggravating, sniffed Rebecca. What do you think really ailed Edward? Asked Emma in hardly more than a whisper. She did not look at her sister. I know you said he had terrible pains in his stomach and had spasms, but what do you think made him have them? Henry called it gastric trouble. You know Edward has always had dyspepsia. Mrs. Brigham hesitated a moment. Was there any talk of an examination? Said she. Then Caroline turned on her fiercely. No, said she in a terrible voice. No. The three sisters' souls seemed to meet on one common ground of terrified understanding through their eyes. The old-fashioned latch of the door was heard to rattle, and a push from without made the door shake ineffectually. It's Henry, Rebecca sighed rather than whispered. Mrs. Brigham settled herself after a noiseless rush across the floor in her rocking chair again, and was swaying back and forth with her head comfortably leaning back when the door at last yielded and Henry Glynn entered. He cast a covertly sharp, comprehensive glance at Mrs. Brigham with her elaborate calm, at Rebecca quietly huddled in the corner of the sofa with her handkerchief to her face and only one small, uncovered, reddened ear as attentive as a dog's, and at Caroline, sitting with a strained composure in her armchair by the stove. She met his eyes quite firmly, with a look of inscrutable fear, and defiance of the fear, and of him. Henry Glynn looked more like his sister than the others. Both had the hard delicacy of form and aquilinity of features. They confronted each other with the pitiless immovability of two statues in whose marble lineaments emotions were fixed for all eternity. Then Henry Glynn smiled, and the smile transformed his face. He looked suddenly years younger, and an almost boyish recklessness appeared in his face. He flung himself into a chair with a gesture which was bewildering from its incongruity with his general appearance. He leaned his head back, flung one leg over the other, and looked laughingly at Mrs. Brigham. "I declare, Emma, you grow younger every year," he said. She flushed a little, and her placid mouth widened at the corners. She was susceptible to praise. "Our thoughts today ought to belong to the one of us who will never grow older," said Caroline in a hard voice. Henry looked at her, still smiling. "Of course, we none of us forget that," said he, in a deep, gentle voice. "But we have to speak to the living, Caroline, and I have not seen Emma for a long time, and the living are as dear as the dead." "Not to me," said Caroline. She rose, and went abruptly out of the room again. Rebecca also rose and hurried after her, sobbing loudly. Henry looked slowly after them. "Caroline is completely unstrung," said he. Mrs. Brigham rocked. A confidence in him inspired by his manner was stealing over her. Out of that confidence she spoke quite easily and naturally. "His death was very sudden," said she. Henry's eyelids quivered slightly, but his gaze was unswerving. "Yes," said he, "it was very sudden. He was sick only a few hours." "What did you call it?" "Gastric." "Did you not think of an examination?" "There is no need. I am perfectly certain as to the cause of his death." Suddenly Mrs. Brigham felt a creep, as of some live horror, over her very soul. Her flesh prickled with cold before an inflection of his voice. She rose, tottering on weak knees. "Where are you going?" asked Henry, in a strange, breathless voice. Mrs. Brigham said something incoherent about sewing, which she had to do, some black for the funeral, and was out of the room. She went up to the front chamber, which she occupied. Caroline was there. She went close to her and took her hands, and the two sisters looked at each other. "Don't speak, don't. I won't have it," said Caroline finally, in an awful whisper. "I won't," replied Emma. That afternoon, the three sisters were in the study. Mrs. Brigham was hemming some black material, as she laid her work on her lap. "It's no use. I cannot see to sew another stitch until we have a light," said she. Caroline, who was writing some letters at the table, turned to Rebecca in her usual place on the sofa. "Rebecca, you would better get a lamp," she said. Rebecca started up. Even in the dusk, her face showed her agitation. "It doesn't seem that we need a lamp quite yet," she said in a piteous, pleading voice, like a child's. "Yes, we do," returned Mrs. Brigham, peremptorily. "I can't see to sew another stitch." Rebecca rose and left the room. Presently she entered with a lamp. She set it on the table, an old-fashioned card table, which was placed against the opposite wall from the window. That opposite wall was taken up with 3 doors. The one small space was occupied by the table. "What have you put the lamp over there for?" asked Mrs. Brigham with some more of impatience than her voice usually revealed. "Why didn't you set it in the hall and have done with it? Neither Caroline nor I can see it if it's on that table." "I thought perhaps you would move," replied Rebecca hoarsely. "If I do move, we can't both sit at that table. Caroline has her paper all spread about. Why don't you set the lamp on the study table in the middle of the room where we can both see?" Rebecca hesitated. Her face was very pale. She looked with an appeal that was fairly agonizing at her sister Caroline. "Why don't you put the lamp on this table, as she says?" asked Caroline, almost fiercely. "Why do you act so, Rebecca?" Rebecca took the lamp and set it on the table in the middle of the room without another word. Then she seated herself on the sofa and placed a hand over her eyes as if to shade them, and remained so. "Does the light hurt your eyes, and that is the reason why you didn't want the lamp?" asked Mrs. Brigham kindly. "I always like to sit in the dark," replied Rebecca chokingly. Then she snatched her handkerchief hastily from her pocket and began to weep. Caroline continued to write, Mrs. Brigham to sew. Suddenly, Mrs. Brigham, as she sewed, glanced at the opposite wall. The glance became a steady stare. She looked intently, her work suspended in her hands. Then she looked away again and took a few more stitches. Then she looked again, and again turned to her task. At last she laid her work in her lap and stared concentratedly. She looked from the wall round the room, taking note of the various objects. Then she turned to her sisters. "What is that?" said she. "What?" asked Caroline harshly. "That strange shadow on the wall," replied Mrs. Brigham. Rebecca sat with her face hidden. Caroline dipped her pen in the inkstand. "Why don't you turn around and look?" asked Mrs. Brigham in a wondering and somewhat aggrieved way. "I am in a hurry to finish this letter," replied Caroline shortly. Mrs. Brigham rose, her work slipping to the floor, and began walking round the room, moving various articles of furniture, with her eyes on the shadow. Then suddenly she shrieked out, "Look at this awful shadow! What is it? Caroline, look, look! Rebecca, look! What is it?" All of Mrs. Brigham's triumphant placidity was gone. Her handsome face was livid with horror. She stood stiffly, pointing at the shadow. Then, after a shuddering glance at the wall, Rebecca burst out in a wild wail. "Oh, Caroline, there it is again! There it is again!" "Caroline Glynn, you look!" said Mrs. Brigham. "Look! What is that dreadful shadow?" Caroline rose, turned, and stood confronting the wall. "How should I know?" she said. "It has been there every night since he died," cried Rebecca. "Every night?" "Yes, he died Thursday, and this is Saturday. That makes 3 nights," said Caroline rigidly. She stood, as if holding her calm with a vice of concentrated will. It looks like, stammered Mrs. Brigham, in a tone of intense horror. "I know what it looks like well enough," said Caroline. "I've got eyes in my head." "It looks like Edward," burst out Rebecca in a sort of frenzy of fear. Only... Yes, it does, assented Mrs. Brigham, whose horror-stricken tone matched her sister's. Only... Oh, it is awful. What is it, Caroline? I ask you again, how should I know? Replied Caroline. I see it there like you. How should I know any more than you? It must be something in the room, said Mrs. Brigham, staring wildly around. We moved everything in the room the first night it came, said Rebecca. It is not anything in the room. Caroline turned upon her with a sort of fury. Of course it is something in the room, said she. How you act! What do you mean, talking so? Of course it is something in the room. Of course it is, agreed Mrs. Brigham, looking at Caroline suspiciously. It must be something in the room. It is not anything in the room, repeated Rebecca with obstinate horror. The door opened suddenly, and Henry Glynn entered. He began to speak, then his eyes followed the direction of the others. He stood staring at the shadow on the wall. What is that? He demanded, in a strange voice. It must be due to something in the room, Mrs. Brigham said faintly. Henry Glynn stood and stared a moment longer. His face showed a gamut of emotions: horror, conviction, then furious incredulity. Suddenly, he began hastening hither and thither about the room. He moved the furniture with fierce jerks, turning ever to see the effect upon the shadow on the wall. Not a line of its terrible outlines wavered. It must be something in the room, he declared in a voice which seemed to snap like a lash. His face changed. The inmost secrecy of his nature seemed evident upon his face, until one almost lost sight of his lineaments. Rebecca stood close to her sofa, regarding him with woeful, fascinated eyes. Mrs. Brigham clutched Caroline's hand. They both stood in a corner, out of his way. For a few moments, he raged about the room like a caged, wild animal. He moved every piece of furniture. When moving of a piece did not affect the shadow, he flung it to the floor. Then suddenly, he desisted. He laughed. What an absurdity, he said easily. Such a to-do about a shadow. That's so, assented Mrs. Brigham in a scared voice, which she tried to make natural. As she spoke, she lifted a chair near her. I think you have broken the chair that Edward was fond of, said Caroline. Terror and wrath were struggling for expression on her face. Her mouth was set, her eyes shrinking. Henry lifted the chair with a show of anxiety. Just as good as ever, he said pleasantly. He laughed again, looking at his sisters. Did I scare you? He said. I should think you might be used to me by this time. You know my way of wanting to leap to the bottom of a mystery, and that shadow does look queer-like, and I thought if there was any way of accounting for it, I would like to without any delay. You don't seem to have succeeded, remarked Caroline dryly, with a slight glance at the wall. Henry's eyes followed hers, and he quivered perceptibly. Oh, there is no accounting for shadows, he said, and he laughed again. A man is a fool to try to account for shadows. Then the supper bell rang, and they all left the room, but Henry kept his back to the wall, as did, indeed, the others. Henry led the way with an alert motion like a boy. Rebecca brought up the rear. She could scarcely walk, her knees trembled so. I can't sit in that room again this evening, she whispered to Caroline after supper. Very well, we will sit in the south room, replied Caroline. I think we will sit in the south parlor, she said aloud. It isn't as damp as the study, and I have a cold. So they all sat in the south room with their sewing. Henry read the newspaper, his chair drawn close to the lamp on the table. About 9 o'clock, he rose abruptly and crossed the hall to the study. The three sisters looked at one another. Mrs. Brigham rose, folding her rustling skirts compactly around her, and began tiptoeing toward the door. What are you going to do? Inquired Rebecca agitatedly. I'm going to see what he is about, replied Mrs. Brigham cautiously. As she spoke, she pointed to the study door across the hall. It was ajar. Henry had striven to pull it together behind him, but it had somehow swollen beyond the limit with curious speed. It was still ajar, and a streak of light showed from top to bottom. Mrs. Brigham folded her skirts so tightly that her bulk with its swelling curves was revealed in a black silk sheath, and she went with a slow toddle across the hall to the study door. She stood there, her eye at the crack. In the south room, Rebecca stopped sewing and sat watching with dilated eyes. Caroline sewed steadily. What Mrs. Brigham, standing at the crack in the study door, saw was this. Henry Glynn, evidently reasoning that the source of the strange shadow must be between the table on which the lamp stood and the wall, was making systematic passes and thrusts with an old sword, which had belonged to his father, all over and through the intervening space. Not an inch was left unpierced. He seemed to have divided the space into mathematical sections. He brandished the sword with a sort of cold fury and calculation. The blade gave out flashes of light. The shadow remained unmoved. Mrs. Brigham, watching, felt herself cold with horror. Finally, Henry ceased, and stood with the sword in hand and raised as if to strike, surveying the shadow on the wall threateningly. Mrs. Brigham toddled back across the hall and shut the south room door behind her before she related what she had seen. "He looked like a demon," she said again. "Have you got any of that old wine in the house, Caroline? I don't feel as if I could stand much more." "Yes, there's plenty," said Caroline. "You can have some when you go to bed." "I think we'd all better take some," said Mrs. Brigham. "Oh, Caroline, what—" "Don't ask. Don't speak," said Caroline. "No, I'm not going to," replied Mrs. Brigham, "but—" Soon the three sisters went to their chambers, and the south parlor was deserted. Caroline called to Henry, in the study, to put out the light before he came upstairs. They had been gone about an hour, when he came into the room, bringing the lamp, which had stood in the study. He set it on the table, and waited a few minutes, pacing up and down. His face was terrible. His fair complexion showed livid, and his blue eyes seemed dark blanks of awful reflections. Then he took up the lamp and returned to the library. He set the lamp on the center table, and the shadow sprang out on the wall. Again, he studied the furniture and moved it about, but deliberately, with none of his former frenzy. Nothing affected the shadow. Then he returned to the south room with the lamp and again waited. Again, he returned to the study and placed the lamp on the table, and the shadow sprang out upon the wall. It was midnight before he went upstairs. Mrs. Brigham and the other sisters, who could not sleep, heard him. The next day was the funeral. That evening, the family sat in the south room. Some relatives were with them. Nobody entered the study until Henry carried a lamp in there after the others had retired for the night. He saw again the shadow on the wall leap to an awful life before the light. The next morning, at breakfast, Henry Glynn announced that he had to go to the city for 3 days. The sisters looked at him with surprise. He very seldom left home, and just now his practice had been neglected on account of Edward's death. "How can you leave your patients now?" asked Mrs. Brigham wonderingly. I don't know how to, but there is no other way," replied Henry easily. "I've had a telegram from Dr. Mitford." "Consultation?" inquired Mrs. Brigham. "I have business," replied Henry. Dr. Mitford was an old classmate of his who lived in a neighboring city, and who occasionally called upon him in the case of a consultation. After he had gone, Mrs. Brigham said to Caroline that, after all, Henry had not said he was going to consult with Dr. Mitford. She thought it very strange. "Everything is very strange," said Rebecca with a shudder. "What do you mean?" inquired Caroline. "Nothing," replied Rebecca. Nobody entered the study that day, nor the next. The third day Henry was expected home, but he did not arrive, and the last train from the city had come. "I call it pretty queer work," said Mrs. Brigham. "The idea of a doctor leaving his patients at such a time as this, and the idea of a consultation lasting 3 days. There is no sense in it, and now he has not come. I don't understand it, for my part." "I don't either," said Rebecca. They were all in the south parlor. There was no light in the study. The door was ajar. Presently Mrs. Brigham rose. She could not have told why. Something seemed to impel her, some will outside her own. She went out of the room, again wrapping her rustling skirts round that she might pass noiselessly, and began pushing the swollen door of the study. "She has not got any lamp," said Rebecca in a shaking voice. Caroline, who was writing letters, rose again, took the only remaining lamp in the room, and followed her sister. Rebecca had risen, but she stood trembling, not venturing to follow. The doorbell rang, but the others did not hear it. It was on the south door on the other side of the house from the study. Rebecca, after hesitating until the bell rang the second time, went to the door. She remembered that the servant was out. Caroline and her sister entered, and her sister Emma entered the study. Caroline set the lamp on the table. They looked at the wall, and there were 2 shadows. The sisters stood clutching each other, staring at the awful things on the wall, and then Rebecca came in staggering with a telegram in her hand. "Here is a telegram," she gasped. "Henry is dead." The end. Also, thank you, Remy, for the raid. I hope your bedtime is lovely. Please get lots of rest. Let me get you a raid shout out. But welcome in, raiders. Alright. I hope you guys had fun with Remy today during her spooky-thon. Whoa, yeah. The shadows on the wall. So yeah, that was aptly named The Shadows on the Wall by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Also, welcome in, Locke. Thank you for the hydrate redeem. Everyone make sure you get a sip of something. Doesn't matter what it is. Something is better than nothing. It was a good time. Remy even made a new song. Ooh, a new song. That sounds fun. I'm glad you guys had a nice time. We're just doing some horror, some ghost story reading. That first one was, I'm fairly sure it was implied that Henry killed Edward, maybe poisoned him. And then Edward was haunting the house. And then Henry died. Strange to say, I don't know how Henry died. Somewhere in the city. I guess people die all the time in the city. So I thought it was interesting that in that story, they'd never actually really said what the shadow looked like. And I wasn't sure if that was kind of a censorship thing, where they wanted it to be published, but it couldn't be too shocking, or if it was the idea that anything that you or I come up with is infinitely scarier than anything described. But I liked that one a lot. A mild ghost story. Didn't they say it looked like Edward? Yeah, they mentioned it looked like Edward. Where was it? It looks like Edward burst out Rebecca in a sort of frenzy only. And then she, breaks off. And then, what did they say? Anything else about it? Yeah, it looks like Edward, but there's, something wrong with it. They can tell that it looks like their brother, but, something is wrong. So I wasn't sure if it was, a headless shadow, or, I don't know, if he was making some sort of gesture, he was, I don't know, something, something terrifying, something scary. But that was that one. So yeah, I just like that they didn't go into deep detail. Leaving to the imagination is better though, very spooky. Yes. They did a good job with that one. Let me see. Let me go back into Kaidan by Lafcadio Hearn. Lafcadio Hearn had a bad habit of writing romaji very strangely, so it's a bit of a challenge to read sometimes. Let's see. Oh yeah, this one is short. This one is from Kaidan by Lafcadio Hearn. So it's a collection of Japanese ghost stories. And this one is called Oshidori. There was a falconer and hunter named Sanjo who lived in the district called Tamura no Go of the province of Mutsu. One day, he went out hunting and could not find any game. But on his way home, at a place called Akanuma, he perceived a pair of oshidori, mandarin ducks, swimming together in a river that he was about to cross. To kill oshidori is not good, but Sanjo happened to be very hungry, and he shot at the pair. His arrow pierced the male. The female escaped into the rushes of the further shore and disappeared. Sanjo took the dead bird home and cooked it. That night he dreamed a dreary dream. It seemed to him that a beautiful woman came into his room and stood by his pillow and began to weep. So bitterly did she weep that Sanjo felt as if his heart was being torn out while he listened. And the woman cried to him, "Why? Oh, why did you have to kill him? Of what wrongs was he guilty? At Akanuma we were so happy together, and you killed him. What harm did he ever do to you? Do you even know what you have done? Oh, do you know what a cruel, wicked thing you have done? Me too you have killed, for I will not live without my husband. Only to tell you this I came." Then again she wept aloud, so bitterly that the voice of her crying pierced into the marrow of the listener's bones. She sobbed out the words of this poem. Hi kurureba sasoeshi mono o Akanuma no makono no kure no hitori ne zo uki. At the coming of twilight, I invited him to return with me, now to sleep alone in the shadow of the rushes of Akanuma. Ah, what misery unspeakable. After having uttered these verses, she exclaimed, "Ah, you do not know, you cannot know what you have done, but tomorrow when you go to Akanuma you will see, you will see." So saying, and weeping very piteously, she went away. When Sanjo awoke in the morning, this dream remained so vivid in his mind that he was greatly troubled. He remembered the words, "But tomorrow when you go to Akanuma you will see, you will see." And he resolved to go there at once, that he might learn whether his dream was anything more than a dream. So he went to Akanuma, and there, when he came to the river bank, he saw the female oshidori swimming alone. In the same moment the bird perceived Sanjo, but instead of trying to escape, she swam straight towards him, looking at him the while in a strange, fixed way. Then with her beak, she suddenly tore open her own body and died before the hunter's eyes. Sanjo shaved his head and became a priest. So, I guess the moral of the story to that one is don't kill mandarin ducks. They're bad luck. You'll be haunted by the ghost of one until you're so overcome in horror that you convert to becoming a priest instead. Let me see. Let's go back to the other book. Let's see. What other ones do we have? There's one called The Beast with 5 Fingers. I have not read this one though. Maybe we'll try it out. This is from that first anthology, The Beast with 5 Fingers by W.F. Harvey. When I was a little boy, I once went with my father to call on Adrian Borosover. I played on the floor with a black spaniel while my father appealed for a subscription. Just before we left, my father said, "Mr. Borosover, may my son here shake hands with you. It will be a thing to look back upon with pride when he grows to be a man." I came up to the bed on which the old man was lying and put my hand in his. awed by the still beauty of his face. He spoke to me kindly, and hoped that I should always try to please my father. Then he placed his right hand on my head and asked for a blessing to rest upon me. "Amen," said my father. Then I followed him out of the room, feeling as if I wanted to cry. But my father was in excellent spirits. "That old gentleman, Jim," said he, "is the most wonderful man in the whole town. For 10 years he has been quite blind." "But I saw his eyes," I said. "They were ever so black and shiny. They weren't shut up like Nora's puppies. Can't he see at all?" And so I learnt for the first time that a man might have eyes that look dark and beautiful and shining without being able to see. "Just like Mrs. Tomlinson has big ears," I said, "and can't hear at all except when Mr. Tomlinson shouts." "Jim," said my father, "it's not right to talk about a lady's ears. Remember what Mr. Borlsover said about pleasing me and being a good boy." That was the only time I saw Adrian Borlsover. I soon forgot about him, and the hand which he laid in blessing on my head, but for a week I prayed that those dark, tender eyes might see me. "His spaniel may have puppies," I said in my prayers, "and he will never be able to know how funny they look with their eyes all closed up. Please let old Mr. Borlsover see." Adrian Borlsover, as my father had said, was a wonderful man. He came of an eccentric family. Borlsover's sons, for some reason, always seemed to marry very ordinary women, which perhaps accounted for the fact that no Borlsover had been a genius, and only one Borlsover had been mad. But they were great champions of little causes, generous patrons of odd sciences, founders of querulous sects, trustworthy guides to the by-path meadows of erudition. Adrian was an authority on the fertilization of orchids. He had held at one time the family living at Borlsover Conyers, until a congenital weakness of the lungs obliged him to seek a less rigorous climate in the sunny south coast watering place where I had seen him. Occasionally he would relieve one or other of the local clergy. My father described him as a fine preacher, who gave long, inspiring sermons from what many men would have considered unprofitable texts. "An excellent proof," he would add, "of the truth of the doctrine of direct verbal inspiration." Adrian Borlsover was exceedingly clever with his hands. His penmanship was exquisite. He illustrated all his scientific papers, made his own woodcuts, and carved the ridorose that is at present the chief feature of interest in the church at Borlsover Conyers. He had an exceedingly clever knack in cutting silhouettes for young ladies and paper pigs and cows for little children, and made more than one complicated wind instrument of his own devising. When he was 50 years old, Adrian Borlsover lost his sight. In a wonderfully short time he had adapted himself to the new conditions of life. He quickly learned to read Braille. So marvelous indeed was his sense of touch that he was still able to maintain his interest in botany. The mere passing of his long supple fingers over a flower was sufficient means for its identification, though occasionally he would use his lips. I have found several letters of his among my father's correspondence. In no case was there anything to show that he was afflicted with blindness, and this in spite of the fact that he exercised undue economy in the spacing of lines. Towards the close of his life, the old man was credited with powers of touch that seemed almost uncanny. It had been said that he could tell at once the color of a ribbon placed between his fingers. My father would neither confirm nor deny the story. Adrian Borlsover was a bachelor. His elder brother George had married late in life, leaving one son, Eustace, who lived in the gloomy Georgian mansion at Borlsover Conyers, where he could work undisturbed in collecting materials for his great book on heredity. Like his uncle, he was a remarkable man. The Borlsovers had always been born naturalists, but Eustace possessed in a special degree the power of systematizing his knowledge. He had received his university education in Germany, and then, after postgraduate work in Vienna and Naples, had traveled for 4 years in South America and the East, getting together a large store of material for a new study into the processes of variation. He lived alone at Borlsover Conyers, with Saunders as his secretary, a man who bore a somewhat dubious reputation in the district, but whose powers as a mathematician combined with his business abilities were invaluable to Eustace. Uncle and nephew saw little of each other. The visits of Eustace were confined to a week in the summer or autumn, long weeks that dragged almost as slowly as the bath chair in which the old man was drawn along the sunny sea front. In their way, the two men were fond of each other, though their intimacy would doubtless have been greater had they shared the same religious views. Adrian held to the old-fashioned evangelical dogmas of his early manhood. His nephew, for many years, had been thinking of embracing Buddhism. Both men possessed, too, the reticence the Borlsovers had always shown, and which their enemies sometimes called hypocrisy. With Adrian, it was a reticence as to the things he had left undone, but with Eustace, it seemed that the curtain which he was so careful to leave undrawn hid something more than a half-empty chamber. 2 years before his death, Adrian Borlsover developed, unknown to himself, the not uncommon power of automatic writing. Eustace made the discovery by accident. Adrian was sitting in bed, the forefinger of his left hand tracing the Braille letters, when his nephew noticed that a pencil the old man held in his right hand was moving slowly along the opposite page. He left his seat in the window and sat down beside the bed. The right hand continued to move, and now he could plainly see that they were letters and words which it was forming. Adrian Borlsover wrote the hand. Eustace Borlsover, George Borlsover, Francis Borlsover, Sigismund Borlsover, Adrian Borlsover, Eustace Borlsover, Saville Borlsover, B for Borlsover. Honesty is the best policy. Beautiful Belinda Borlsover. What curious nonsense, said Eustace to himself. King George III ascended the throne in 1760, wrote the hand. Crowd, a noun of multitude, a collection of individuals. Adrian Borlsover, Eustace Borlsover. It seems to me, said his uncle upon closing the book, that you had much better make the most of the afternoon sunshine and take your walk now. I think perhaps I will, Eustace answered as he picked up the volume. I won't go far, and when I come back I can read to you those articles in Nature about which we were speaking. He went along the promenade, but stopped at the first shelter, and seating himself in the corner best protected from the wind, he examined the book at leisure. Nearly every page was scored with a meaningless jungle of pencil marks. Rows of capital letters, short words, long words, complete sentences, copybook tags. The whole thing, in fact, had the appearance of a copybook, and on a more careful scrutiny, Eustace thought that there was ample evidence to show that the handwriting at the beginning of the book, good though it was not nearly so good as the handwriting at the end. He left his uncle at the end of October, with a promise to return in December. It seemed to him quite clear that the old man's power of automatic writing was developing rapidly, and for the first time he looked forward to a visit that combined duty with interest. But on his return, he was at first disappointed. His uncle, he thought, looked older. He was listless, too, preferring others to read to him, and dictating nearly all his letters. Not until the day before he left had Eustace an opportunity of observing Adrian Borlsover's newfound faculty. The old man, propped up in bed with pillows, had sunk into a light sleep. His 2 hands lay on the coverlet, his left hand tightly grasping his right. Eustace took an empty manuscript book and placed a pencil within reach of the fingers of the right hand. They snatched at it eagerly, then dropped the pencil to unloose the left hand from its remaining grasp. Perhaps to prevent interference, I had better hold that hand, said Eustace to himself as he watched the pencil. Almost immediately, it began to write. Blundering Borlsovers, unnecessarily unnatural, extraordinarily eccentric, culpably curious. Who are you? Asked Eustace in a low voice. Never you mind, wrote the hand of Adrian. Is it my uncle who is writing? Oh, my prophetic soul, mine uncle. Is it anyone I know? Silly Eustace, you'll see me very soon. When shall I see you? when poor old Adrian's dead. Where shall I see you? Where shall you not? Instead of speaking his next question, Borlsover wrote it. What is the time? The fingers dropped the pencil and moved 3 or 4 times across the paper. Then picking up the pencil, they wrote, 10 minutes before 4. Put your book away, Eustace. Adrian mustn't find us working at this sort of thing. He doesn't know what to make of it, and I won't have poor old Adrian disturbed. Au revoir. Adrian Borlsover awoke with a start. I've been dreaming again, he said. Such queer dreams of leaguered cities and forgotten towns. You were mixed up in this one, Eustace, though I can't remember how. Eustace, I want to warn you. Don't walk in doubtful paths. Choose your friends well. Your poor grandfather. A fit of coughing put an end to what he was saying, but Eustace saw that the hand was still writing. He managed unnoticed to draw the book away. I'll light the gas, he said, and ring for tea. On the other side of the bed curtain, he saw the last sentence that had been written. It's too late for Adrian, he read. We're friends already, aren't we, Eustace Borlsover? On the following day, Eustace Borlsover left. He thought his uncle looked ill when he said goodbye, and the old man spoke despondently of the failure his life had been. Nonsense, uncle, said his nephew. You have got over your difficulties in a way not 1 in 100,000 would have done. Everyone marvels at your splendid perseverance in teaching your hand to take the place of your lost sight. To me, it's been a revelation of the possibilities of education. Education, said his uncle dreamily, as if the word had started a new train of thought. Education is good, so long as you know to whom and for what purpose you give it. But with the lower orders of men, the base and more sordid spirits, I have grave doubts as to its results. Well, goodbye, Eustace. I may not see you again. You are a true Borlsover with all the Borlsover faults. Marry, Eustace, marry some good, sensible girl. And if by any chance I don't see you again, my will is at my solicitor's. I've not left you any legacy because I know you're well provided for, but I thought you might like to have my books. Oh, and there's just one other thing. You know, before the end, people often lose control over themselves and make absurd requests. Don't pay any attention to them, Eustace. Goodbye. He held out his hand. Eustace took it. It remained in his a fraction of a second longer than he had expected, and gripped him with a virility that was surprising. There was, too, in its touch, a subtle sense of intimacy. Why, uncle, I shall see you alive and well for many long years to come. 2 months later, Adrian Borlsover died. Alright, let me get a drink of water. That was chapter 1 of this. I do not like the hand. Also, I'm not sure if you guys know what automatic writing is it's a spiritualism technique. It's almost like a Ouija board, but instead it's someone who is like a psychic or possessed in some cases writes, and the things they write are like things that a ghost is like powering the writing. It's not the person actually in charge of it. So in this case, his uncle was like channeling some other entity who was writing to him. Alright, chapter 2. Eustace Borlsover was in Naples at the time. He read the obituary notice in the Morning Post on the day announced for the funeral. Poor old fellow, he said. I wonder where I shall find room for all his books. The question occurred to him again with greater force when 3 days later he found himself standing in the library at Borlsover Conyers, a huge room built for use, not for beauty, in the year of Waterloo by a Borlsover who was an ardent admirer of the great Napoleon. It was arranged on the plan of many college libraries, with tall, projecting bookcases forming deep recesses of dusty silence, fit graves for the old hates of forgotten controversy, the dead passions of forgotten lives. At the end of the room, behind the bust of some unknown 18th century divine, an ugly iron corkscrew stair led to a shelf-lined gallery. Nearly every shelf was full. I must talk to Saunders about it, said Eustace. I suppose it will be necessary to have the billiards room fitted up with bookcases. The two men met for the first time after many weeks in the dining room that evening. "Hello," said Eustace, standing before the fire with his hands in his pockets. "How goes the world, Saunders? Why these dress togs?" He himself was wearing an old shooting jacket. He did not believe in mourning, as he had told his uncle on his last visit, and though he normally went in for quiet colored ties, he wore this evening one of an ugly red, in order to shock Morton the butler, and to make them thrash the whole question of mourning for themselves in the servants' hall. Eustace was a true Borlsover. "The world," said Saunders, "goes the same as usual, confoundedly slow. The dress togs are accounted for by an invitation from Captain Lockwood to bridge." "How are you getting there?" "I've told your coachman to drive me in your carriage. Any objection?" "Oh, dear me, no. We've had all things in common for far too many years for me to raise objections at this hour of the day." "You'll find your correspondence in the library," went on Saunders. "Most of it I've seen to. There are a few private letters I haven't opened. There's also a box with a rat or something inside that it came by the evening post. Very likely it's the six-toed albino. I didn't look, because I didn't want to mess up my things, but I should gather from the way it's jumping that it's pretty hungry." "Oh, I'll see to it," said Eustace, "and while you and the captain earn an honest penny." Dinner over and Saunders gone, Eustace went into the library. Though the fire had been lit, it was by no means cheerful. "We'll have all the lights on, at any rate," he said as he turned the switches. "And Morton," he added, when the butler brought the coffee, "get me a screwdriver or something to undo this box. Whatever the animal is, he's kicking up the deuce of a row. What is it? Why are you dawdling?" "If you please, sir, when the postman brought it, he told me that they'd bored the holes in the lid at the post office. There were no breathing holes in the lid, sir. They didn't want the animal to die. That is all, sir." "It's culpably careless of the man, whoever he was," said Eustace as he removed the screws, "packing an animal like this in a wooden box with no means of getting air. Confound it all! I meant to ask Morton to bring me a cage to put it in. Now I suppose I shall have to get one myself." He placed a heavy book on the lid, from which the screws had been removed, and went into the billiards room. As he came back into the library with an empty cage in his hand, he heard the sound of something falling, and then of something scuttling along the floor. "Bother it! The beast got out. How in the world am I to find it again in this library?" To search for it did indeed seem hopeless. He tried to follow the sound of the scuttling in one of the recesses where the animal seemed to be running behind the books and the shelves, but it was impossible to locate it. Eustace resolved to go on quietly reading. Very likely that the animal might gain confidence and show itself. Saunders seemed to have dealt in his usual methodical manner with most of the correspondence. There were still the private letters. What was that? 2 sharp clicks, and the lights in the hideous candelabra that hung from the ceiling suddenly went out. "I wonder if something's gone wrong with the fuse," said Eustace, and he went to the switches by the door. Then he stopped. There was a noise at the other end of the room, as if something was crawling up the iron corkscrew stair. "If it's gone into the gallery," he said, "well and good." He hastily turned on the lights, crossed the room, and climbed up the stair, but he could see nothing. His grandfather had placed a little gate at the top of the stair, so that children could run and romp in the gallery without fear of accident. This Eustace closed, and having considerably narrowed the circle of his search, returned to his desk by the fire. How gloomy the library was. There was no sense of intimacy about the room. The few busts of an 18th century Borlsover had brought back from the Grand Tour might have been in keeping in the old library. Here they seemed out of place. They made the room feel cold, in spite of the heavy red damask curtains and great gilt cornices. With a crash, 2 heavy books fell from the gallery to the floor. Then, as Borlsover looked over, another, and yet another. "Very well. You'll starve for this, my beauty," he said. "We'll do some little experiments on the metabolism of rats deprived of water. Go on, chuck them down. I think I've got the upper hand." He turned once again to his correspondence. The letter was from the family solicitor. It spoke of his uncle's death, and the valuable collection of books that had been left to him in the will. "There is one request," he read, "which certainly came as a surprise to me. As you know, Mr. Adrian Borlsover had left instructions that his body was to be buried in as simple a manner as possible at Eastbourne. He expressed a desire that there should be neither wreaths nor flowers of any kind, and hoped that his friends and relatives would not consider it necessary to wear mourning. The day before his death, we received a letter cancelling these instructions. He wished his body to be embalmed. He gave us the address of the man we were to employ, Pennifer, Ludgate Hill, with orders that his right hand was to be sent to you, stating that it was your special request. The other arrangements as to the funeral remained unaltered." "Good Lord," said Eustace, "what in the world was the old boy driving at? And what in the name of all that's holy is that?" Someone was in the gallery. Someone had pulled the cord attached to one of the blinds, and it had rolled up with a snap. Someone must be in the gallery, for a second blind did the same. Someone must be walking round the gallery, for one after the other the blinds sprang up, letting in the moonlight. "I haven't got to the bottom of this yet," said Eustace, "but I will do before the night is very much older," and he hurried up the corkscrew stair. He had just gotten to the top when the lights went out a second time, and he heard again the scuttling along the floor. Quickly he stole on tiptoe in the dim moonlight in the direction of the noise, feeling as he went for one of the switches. His fingers touched the metal knob at last. He turned on the electric light. About 10 yards in front of him, crawling along the floor, was a man's hand. Eustace stared at it in utter astonishment. It was moving quickly, in the manner of a geometer caterpillar. The fingers, humped up one moment, flattened out the next. The thumb appeared to give a crab-like motion to the whole. While he was looking, too surprised to stir, the hand disappeared round the corner. Eustace ran forward. He no longer saw it, but he could hear it as it squeezed its way behind the books in one of the shelves. A heavy volume had been displaced. There was a gap in the row of books where it had got in. In his fear, lest it should escape him again, he seized the first book that came to his hand and plugged it into the hole. Then, emptying 2 shelves of their contents, he took the wooden boards and propped them up in front to make his barrier doubly sure. "I wish Saunders was back," he said. "One can't tackle this sort of thing alone." It was after 11, and there seemed little likelihood of Saunders returning before 12. He did not dare leave the shelf unwatched, even to run downstairs to ring the bell. Morton the butler often used to come round about 11 to see that the windows were fastened, but he might not come. Eustace was thoroughly unstrung. At last he heard steps down below. "Morton!" he shouted. "Morton!" "Sir? Has Mr. Saunders got back yet?" "Not yet, sir." "Well, bring me some brandy, and hurry up about it. I'm up here in the gallery, you duffer." "Thanks," said Eustace as he emptied the glass. "Don't go to bed yet, Morton. There are a lot of books that have fallen down by accident. Bring them up and put them back in their shelves." Morton had never seen Borlsover in so talkative a mood as on that night. "Here," said Eustace, when the books had all been put back and dusted. "You might hold up these boards for me, Morton. That beast in the box got out, and I've been chasing it all over the place." "I think I can hear it chawing at the books, sir. They're not valuable, I hope. I think that's the carriage, sir. I'll go and call Mr. Saunders." It seemed to Eustace that he was away for 5 minutes, but it could hardly have been more than 1 when he returned with Saunders. "All right, Morton, you can go now. I'm up here, Saunders." "What's all the row?" asked Saunders, as he lounged forward with his hands in his pockets. The luck had been with him all the evening. He was completely satisfied, both with himself and with Captain Lockwood's taste in wines. "What's the matter? You look to me to be in an absolute blue funk." "That old devil of an uncle of mine," began Eustace. "Oh, I can't explain it all. It's his hand that's been playing old Harry all the evening, but I've got it cornered behind these books. You have to help me catch it." "What's up with you, Eustace? What's the game?" "It's no game, you silly idiot. If you don't believe me, take one of those books and put your hand in and feel." "All right," said Saunders, "but wait till I've rolled up my sleeve. The accumulated dust of centuries, eh?" He took off his coat, knelt down, and thrust his arm along the shelf. "There's something there right enough." he said. It's got a funny stumpy end to it, whatever it is, and nips like a crab. Ah, no you don't. He pulled his hand out in a flash. Shove in a book quickly. Now it can't get out. What was it? Asked Eustace. It was something that wanted very much to get a hold of me. I felt what seemed like a thumb and forefinger. Give me some brandy. How are we to get it out of there? What about a landing net? No good. It'd be too smart for us. I tell you, Saunders, it can cover the ground far faster than I can walk, but I think I see how we can manage it. 2 books at the end of the shelf are big ones that go right back against the wall. The others are very thin. I'll take out one at a time, and you slide the rest along until we have it squashed between the end 2. It certainly seemed to be the best plan. One by one, as they took out the books, the space behind grew smaller and smaller. There was something in it that was certainly very much alive. Once they caught sight of the fingers pressing outward for a way of escape. At last they had it pressed between the 2 big books. There's muscle there. If there isn't flesh and blood, said Saunders as he held them together. It seems to be a hand right enough. I suppose this is sort of an infectious hallucination. I've read about such cases before. Infectious fiddlesticks, said Eustace, his face white with anger. Bring the thing downstairs. We'll get it back into the box. It was not altogether easy, but they were successful at last. Drive in the screws, said Eustace. We won't run any risks. Put the box in that old desk of mine. There's nothing in it that I want. Here's the key. Thank goodness there's nothing wrong with the lock. Quite a lively evening, said Saunders. Now let's hear more about your uncle. They sat up together until early morning. Saunders had no desire for sleep. Eustace was trying to explain and to forget, to conceal from himself a fear he had never felt before, the fear of walking alone down the long corridor to his bedroom. Alright, that was chapter 2. Let me get some water before chapter 3. Alright, chapter 3. Whatever it was, said Eustace to Saunders on the following morning, I propose that we drop the subject. There's nothing to keep us here for the next 10 days. We'll motor up to the lakes and get some climbing. And see nobody all day and sit bored to death with each other every night. Not for me, thanks. Why not run up to town? Run's the exact word in this case, isn't it? We're both in such a blessed funk. Pull yourself together, Eustace. Let's have another look at the hand. As you like, said Eustace. There's the key. They went into the library and opened the desk. The box was as they had left it on the previous night. What are you waiting for? Asked Eustace. I'm waiting for you to volunteer to open the lid. However, since you seem to funk it, allow me. There doesn't seem to be the likelihood of any rumpus this morning at all events. He opened the lid and picked out the hand. Cold? Asked Eustace. Tepid. A bit below blood heat by the feel. Soft and supple too. If it's the embalming, it's a sort of embalming I've never seen before. Is it your uncle's hand? Oh yes, it's his all right, said Eustace. I should know those long thin fingers anywhere. Put it back in the box, Saunders. Never mind about the screws. I'll lock the desk, so that there's no chance of it getting out. We'll compromise by motoring up to town for a week. If we get off soon after lunch, we ought to be at Grantham or Stamford by night. Right, said Saunders. And tomorrow? Oh well, by tomorrow we shall have forgotten all about this beastly thing. If when the morrow came and they had not forgotten, it was certainly true that by the end of the week they were about to tell a very vivid ghost story at the little supper Eustace gave on Hallows End. You don't want us to believe that it's true, Mr. Borlsover. How perfectly awful. I'll take my oath on it, and so would Saunders here, wouldn't you, old chap? Any number of oaths, said Saunders. It was a long, thin hand, you know, and it gripped me just like that. Don't, Mr. Saunders, don't. How perfectly horrid. Now tell us another one, do. Only a really creepy one, please. He's a pretty mess, said Eustace, on the following day as he threw a letter across the table to Saunders. It's your affair, though. Mrs. Merritt, if I understand it, gives a month's notice. Oh, that's quite absurd on Mrs. Merritt's part, replied Saunders. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Let's see what it says. Dear Sir, he read, this is to let you know that I must give you a month's notice, as from Tuesday the 13th. For a long time I felt the place too big for me, but when Jane Parfitt and Emily Laidlow go off with scarcely as much as an if you please after frightening the wits out of the other girls, so that they can't turn out a room by themselves or walk alone down the stairs for fear of treading on half-frozen toads or hearing it run along the passages at night. All I can say is that it's no place for me. So I must ask you, Mr. Borlsover, sir, to find a new housekeeper that has no objection to large and lonely houses, which some people do say, not that I believe them for a minute, my poor mother, always having been a Wesleyan, are haunted. Yours faithfully, Elizabeth Merritt. P.S. I should be obliged if you would give my respects to Mr. Saunders. I hope that he won't run no risks with his cold. Saunders, said Eustace, you've always had a wonderful way with you in dealing with servants. You mustn't let poor old Mary go. Of course she shan't go, said Saunders. She's probably only angling for a rise in salary. I'll write to her this morning. No, there's nothing like a personal interview. We've had enough of town. We'll go back tomorrow, and you must work your cold for all it's worth. Don't forget that it's got onto the chest and will require weeks of feeding up and nursing. All right. I think I can manage, Mrs. Merritt. But Mrs. Merritt was more obstinate than he had thought. She was very sorry to hear of Mr. Saunders' cold, and how he lay awake all night in London coughing. Very sorry indeed. She'd change his room for him gladly, and get the south room aired. And wouldn't he have a basin of hot bread and milk last thing at night? But she was afraid she would have to leave at the end of the month. Try her with an increase of salary, was the advice of Eustace. It was no use. Mrs. Merritt was obdurate, though she knew of a Mrs. Handyside, who had been housekeeper to Lord Gargrave, who might be glad to come at the salary mentioned. What's the matter with servants, Morton? Asked Eustace that evening when he brought the coffee into the library. What's all this about Mrs. Merritt wanting to leave? If you please, sir. I was going to mention it myself. I have a confession to make, sir. When I found the note, asking me to open that desk and take out the box with the rat, I broke the lock as you told me, and was glad to do it, because I could hear the animal in the box making a great noise, and I thought it wanted food, so I took out the box, sir, and got a cage and was going to transfer it when the animal got away. What in the world are you talking about? I never wrote any such note. Excuse me, sir. It was the note I picked up here on the floor on the day you and Mr. Saunders left. I have it in my pocket now. It certainly seemed to be in Eustace's handwriting. It was written in pencil, and began somewhat abruptly. Get a hammer, Morton, he read, or some other tool, and break open the lock in the old desk in the library. Take out the box that is inside. You need not do anything else. The lid is already open. Eustace Borlsover. And you opened the desk? Yes, sir. As I was getting the cage ready, the animal hopped out. What animal? The animal inside the box, sir. What did it look like? Well, sir, I couldn't tell you, said Morton nervously. My back was turned, and it was halfway down the room when I looked up. What was its color? Asked Sanders. Black? Oh, no, sir. A grayish-white. It crept along in a very funny way, sir. I don't think it had a tail. What did you do then? I tried to catch it, but it was no use. So I set the rat traps and kept the library shut. Then that girl, Emma Laidlaw, left the door open when she was cleaning, and I think it must have escaped. And you think it was the animal that's been frightening the maids? Well, no, sir, not quite. They said it was, well, you excuse me, sir, a hand that they saw. Emma trod on it once at the bottom of the stairs. She thought then it was a half-frozen toad, only white, and then Parfait was washing up the dishes in the scullery. She wasn't thinking about anything in particular, it was close on dusk. She took her hand out of the water and was drying them absent-minded, like on a roller towel, when she found that she was drying someone else's hand as well, only colder than hers. What nonsense! Exclaimed Saunders. Exactly, sir. That's what I told her, but we couldn't get her to stop. You don't believe all this, asked Eustace, turning suddenly towards the butler. Me, sir? Oh, no, sir. I've not seen anything. Nor heard anything? Well, sir, if you must know, the bells do ring at odd times, and there's nobody there when we go. And when we go round to draw the blinds at night, as often as not somebody's been there before us. But as I says to Mrs. Merritt, a young monkey might do wonderful things, and we all know that Mr. Borlsover had some strange animals about the place. Very well, Morton, that will do. What do you make of it? Asked Saunders, when they were alone. I mean of the letter that he said that you wrote. Oh, that's simple enough, said Eustace. See the paper it's written on? I stopped using that years ago. There are a few odd sheets and envelopes left in the old desk. We never fastened up the lid of the box before locking it in. The hand got out, found a pencil, wrote this note, and shoved it through a crack onto the floor, where Morton found it. That's plain as daylight." "But the hand couldn't write, couldn't it? You've not seen it do the things I've seen," and he told Saunders more of what happened at Eastbourne. "Well," said Saunders, "in that case, we have at least an explanation of the legacy. It was the hand which wrote, unknown to your uncle, that letter to your solicitor, bequeathing itself to you. Your uncle had no more to do with that request than I. In fact, it would seem he had some idea of this automatic writing, and feared it." "Then if it's not my uncle, what is it?" "I suppose some people might say that a disembodied spirit has got your uncle to educate and prepare a little body for it. Now it's got into that little body and is off on its own." "Well, what are we to do?" "We'll keep our eyes open," said Saunders, "and try to catch it. If we can't do that, we'll have to wait till the bally clockwork runs down. After all, if it's flesh and blood, it can't live forever." For 2 days, nothing happened. Then Saunders saw it sliding down the banister in the hall. He was taken unawares, and lost a full second before he started in pursuit, only to find that the thing had escaped him. 3 days later, Eustace, writing alone in the library at night, saw it sitting on an open book at the other end of the room. The fingers crept over the page, feeling the print, as if it was reading. But before he had time to get up from his seat, it had taken the alarm, and was pulling itself up the curtains. Eustace watched it grimly, as it hung on the cornice with 3 fingers, flicking thumb and forefinger at him, in an expression of scornful derision. "I know what I'll do," he said. "If I only get it into the open, I'll set the dogs onto it." He spoke to Saunders of the suggestion. "It's a jolly good idea," he said, "only we won't wait till we find it out of doors. We'll get the dogs. There are 2 terriers, and the underkeeper's Irish mongrel that's onto rats like a flash. Your spaniel has not got spirit enough for this sort of game." They brought the dogs into the house, and the keeper's Irish mongrel chewed up the slippers, and the terriers tripped up Morton as he waited at table. But all 3 were welcome. Even false security is better than no security at all. For a fortnight, nothing happened. Then the hand was caught, not by the dogs, but by Mrs. Merritt's grey parrot. The bird was in the habit of periodically removing the pins that kept its seed and water tins in place, and of escaping through the holes in the side of the cage. When once at liberty, Peter would show no inclination to return, and would often be about the house for days. Now, after 6 consecutive weeks of captivity, Peter had again discovered a new means of unloosening his bolts, and was at large, exploring the tapestried forests of the curtains, and singing songs in praise of liberty from cornice and picture rail. "It's no use your trying to catch him," said Eustace to Mrs. Merritt, as she came into the study one afternoon towards dusk with a step-ladder. "You'd much better leave Peter alone. Starve him into surrender, Mrs. Merritt, and don't leave bananas and seed about for him to peck at when he fancies he's hungry. You're far too soft-hearted." "Well, sir, I see he's right out of reach now on that picture rail, so if you wouldn't mind closing the door, sir. When you leave the room, I'll bring his cage in tonight and put some meat inside it. He's fond of meat, though it does make him pull his feathers to suck the quills. They do say that if you cook—" "Never mind, Mrs. Merritt," said Eustace, who was busy writing. "That will do. I'll keep an eye on the bird." There was silence in the room, unbroken but for the continuous whisper of his pen. "Scratch poor Peter," said the bird. "Scratch poor Peter." "Be quiet, you beastly bird." "Scratch poor Peter. Scratch poor Peter, do." "I'm more likely to wring your neck if I get hold of you." He looked up at the picture rail, and there was a hand holding onto a hook with 3 fingers, slowly scratching the head of a parrot with the 4th. Eustace ran to the bell and pressed it hard, then across to the window, which he closed with a bang. Frightened by the noise, the parrot shook its wings preparatory to flight, and as it did so, the fingers of the hand got hold of it by the throat. There was a shrill scream from Peter as he fluttered across the room, wheeling in circles that ever descended, borne down under the weight that clung to him. The bird dropped at last quite suddenly, and Eustace saw fingers and feathers rolled into an inextricable mess on the floor. The struggle abruptly ceased as the finger and thumb squeezed the neck. The bird's eyes rolled up to show whites, and there was a faint, half-choked gurgle, but before the fingers had time to loosen their hold, Eustace had them in his own. "Send Mr. Saunders here at once," he said to the maid who came to answer the bell. "Tell him I want him immediately." With that he went with the hand to the fire. There was a ragged gash across the back, where the bird's beak had torn it, but no blood oozed from the wound. He noticed with disgust that the nails had grown long and discolored. "I'll burn the beastly thing," he said, but he could not burn it. He tried to throw it into the flames, but his own hands, as if restrained by some old, primitive feeling, would not let him, and so Saunders found him pale and irresolute, with the hands still clasped tightly in his fingers. "I've got it at last," he said in a tone of triumph. "Good. Let's have a look at it. Not when it's loose. Get me some nails and a hammer and a board of some sort." "Can you hold it all right?" "Yes, the thing's quite limp. Tired out with throttling poor old Peter, I should say." "And now," said Saunders when he returned with the things, "what are we going to do?" "Drive a nail through it first, so it can't get away, and then we can take our time over examining it." "Do it yourself," said Saunders. "I don't mind helping you with guinea pigs occasionally when there's something to be learned, partly because I don't fear a guinea pig's revenge. This thing's different." "All right, you miserable skunk. I won't forget the way you've stood by me." He took up a nail, and before Saunders had realized what he was doing, driven it through the hand, deep into the board. "Oh, my aunt," he giggled hysterically, "look at it now." For the hand was writhing in agonized contortions, squirming and wriggling upon the nail like a worm upon the hook. "Well," said Saunders, "you've done it now. I'll leave you to examine it." "Don't go, in heaven's name. Cover it up, man, cover it up. Shove a cloth over it, here." He pulled off the antimacassar from the back of a chair and wrapped the board in it. "Now, get the keys from my pocket and open the safe. Chuck the other things out. Oh Lord, it's getting itself into frightful knots, and open it quick." He threw the thing in and banged the door. "We'll keep it in there till it dies," he said. "May I burn in hell if I ever open the door of that safe again." Mrs. Merritt departed at the end of the month. Her successor was more successful in the management of the servants. Early in her rule, she declared that she would stand no nonsense, and gossip soon withered and died. Eustace Borlsover went back to his old way of life. Old habits crept over and covered his new experience. He was, if anything, less morose, and showed a greater inclination to take his natural part in country society. "I shouldn't be surprised if he marries one of these days," said Saunders. "Well, I'm in no hurry for such an event. I know Eustace far too well for the future Mrs. Borlsover to like me. It will be the same old story again, a long friendship slowly made, marriage, and a long friendship quickly forgotten." Alright, the final chapter. Chapter 4. I feel bad for Peter, the little parrot. But Eustace Borlsover did not follow the advice of his uncle and Mary. He was too fond of old slippers and tobacco. The cooking, too, under Mrs. Handyside's management was excellent, and she seemed, too, to have a heaven-sent faculty in knowing when to stop dusting. Little by little, the old life resumed its old power. Then came the burglary. The men, it was said, broke into the house by way of the conservatory. It was really little more than an attempt, for they only succeeded in carrying away a few pieces of plate from the pantry. The safe in the study was certainly found open and empty, but as Mr. Borlsover informed the police inspector, he had nothing of value in it during the last 6 months. Then you're lucky in getting off so easily, sir," the man replied. "By the way, they've gone about their business. I should say they were experienced cracksmen. They must have caught the alarm when they were beginning their evening's work." "Yes," said Eustace, "I suppose I am lucky." "I have no doubt," said the inspector. "Then we shall be able to trace the men. I've said that they must have been old hands at the game. The way they got in and opened the safe shows that, but there's one little thing that puzzles me. One of them was careless enough to not wear gloves, and I'm bothered if I know what he was trying to do. I've traced his finger marks on the new varnish on the window sashes in every one of the downstairs rooms. They are very distinct ones, too." "Right hand or left or both?" asked Eustace. "Oh, right. Every time. That's the funny thing. He must have been a foolhardy fellow. I think it was him that wrote that." He took a slip of paper out of his pocket. "That's what he wrote, sir. I've got out Eustace Borlsover, but I'll be back before long." "Some galbird just escaped, I suppose. It will make it all the bit easier for us to trace him. Do you know the writing, sir?" "No," said Eustace. "It's not the writing of anyone I know." "I'm not going to stay here any longer," said Eustace to Saunders at luncheon. "I've got on far better during the last 6 months than I ever expected, but I'm not going to run the risk of seeing that thing again. I shall go up to town this afternoon, get Morton to put my things together, and join me with the car at Brighton on the day after tomorrow, and bring the proofs of those 2 papers with you. We'll run them over together. How long are you going to be away? I can't say for certain, but be prepared to stay for some time. We've stuck to work pretty closely through the summer, and I, for one, need a holiday. I'll engage the rooms at Brighton. You'll find it best to break the journey at Hitchin. I'll wire to you there at the Crown to tell you the Brighton address. The house he chose at Brighton was in a terrace. He had been there before. It was kept by his old college friend, a man of discreet silence, who was admirably partnered by an excellent cook. The rooms were on the first floor. The 2 bedrooms were at the back and opened out of each other. Saunders can have the smaller one, though it is the only one with a fireplace. I'll stick to the larger of the 2 since it's got a bathroom adjoining. I wonder what time he'll arrive with the car. Saunders came about 7, cold and cross and dirty. We'll light the fire in the dining room, said Eustace, and get Prince to unpack some of the things while we're at dinner. What were the roads like? Rotten, swimming with mud, and a beastly cold wind against us all day. And this is July. Dear old England. Yes, said Eustace. I think we might do worse than leave dear old England for a few months. They turned in soon after 12. You oughtn't to feel cold, Saunders, said Eustace, when you can afford to sport a great cat-skin-lined coat like this. You do yourself very well, all things considered. Look at those gloves, for instance. Who could possibly feel cold when wearing them? They're far too clumsy, though, for driving. Try them on and see. He tossed them through the door on Eustace's bed, and went about with his unpacking. A minute later, he heard a shrill cry of terror. Oh, Lord, he heard. It's in the glove. Quick, Saunders, quick. Then came a smacking thud. Eustace had thrown it from him. I chucked it into the bathroom, he gasped. It hit the wall, has fallen into the bath. Come now if you want to help. Saunders, with a lighted candle in his hand, looked over the edge of the bath. There it was, old and maimed, dumb and blind, with a ragged hole in the middle, crawling, staggering, trying to creep up the slippery sides, only to fall back, helpless. Stay there, said Saunders. I'll empty a collar box or something and we'll jam it in. It can't get out while I'm away. Yes, it can, shouted Eustace. It's getting out now. It's climbing up the old plug chain. No, you brute, you filthy brute, you don't. Come back, Saunders. It's getting away from me. I can't hold it. It's all slippery. Curse its claw. Shut the window, you idiot. The top too, as well as the bottom. You utter idiot. It got out. There was a sound of something dropping onto the hard flagstones below, and Eustace fell back, fainting. For a fortnight, he was ill. I don't know what to make of it, the doctor said to Saunders. I can only suppose that Mr. Borlsover has suffered some great emotional shock. You had better let me send someone to help you nurse him, and by all means indulge that whim of his, never to be alone in the dark. I would keep a light burning all night if I were you, but he must have more fresh air. It's perfectly absurd, this hatred of open windows. Eustace, however, would have no one with him but Saunders. I don't want the other men, he said. They'd smuggle it in somehow. I know they would. Don't worry about it, old chap. That sort of thing can't go on indefinitely. You know I saw it this time as well as you. It wasn't half so active. It won't go on living much longer, especially after that fall. I heard it hit the flags myself. As soon as you're a bit stronger, we'll leave this place. Not bag and baggage, but with only the clothes on our backs so that it won't be able to hide anywhere. We'll escape it that way. We won't give any address, and we won't have any parcels sent after us. Cheer up, Eustace. You'll be well enough to leave in a day or two. The doctor says I can take you out in a chair tomorrow. What have I done? Asked Eustace. Why does it come after me? I'm no worse than other men. I'm no worse than you, Saunders. You know I'm not. It was you who were at the bottom of that dirty business in San Diego, and that was 15 years ago. It's not that, of course, said Saunders. We're in the 20th century. Even the parsons have dropped the idea of your old sins finding you out. Before you caught the hand in the library, it was filled with pure malevolence, to you and all mankind. After you spiked it through with that nail, it naturally forgot about other people and concentrated its attention on you. It was shut up in the safe, you know, for nearly 6 months. That gives plenty of time for thinking of revenge. Eustace Borlsover would not leave the room, but he thought that there might be something in Saunders' suggestion to leave Brighton without notice. He began rapidly to regain his strength. We'll go on the 1st of September, he said. The evening of August 31st was oppressively warm, though at midday the windows had been wide open. They had been shut an hour or so before dusk. Mrs. Prince had long since ceased to wonder at the strange habits of the gentlemen on the first floor. Soon after their arrival, she had been told to take down the heavy window curtains in the 2 bedrooms, and day by day the rooms had seemed to grow more bare. Nothing was left lying about. Mr. Borlsover doesn't like to have any place where dirt can collect, Saunders had said as an excuse. He likes to see all corners of the room. Can't I open the window just a little, he said to Eustace that evening. We're simply roasting in here, you know. No, well, leave it alone. We're not a couple of boarding school misses fresh from a course of hygiene lectures. Get the chessboard out. They sat down and played. At 10 o'clock, Mrs. Prince came to the door with a note. I'm sorry I didn't bring it before, but it was left in the letterbox. Open it, Saunders, and see if it wants answering. It was very brief. There was neither address nor signature. Will 11 o'clock tonight be suitable for our last appointment? Who is it from? Asked Borlsover. It was meant for me, said Saunders. There's no answer, Mrs. Prince, and he put the paper in his pocket. A dunning letter from a tailor. I most suppose he must have got wind of our leaving. It was a clever lie, and Eustace asked no more questions. They went on with their game. On the landing outside, Saunders could hear the grandfather's clock, whispering the seconds, blurting out the quarter hours. Check, said Eustace. The clock struck 11. At the same time, there was a gentle knocking on the door. It seemed to come from the bottom panel. Who's there? Asked Eustace. There was no answer. Mrs. Prince, is that you? She is up above, said Saunders. I can hear her walking about the room. Then lock the door. Bolt it to. Your move, Saunders. While Saunders sat with his eyes on the chessboard, Eustace walked over to the window and examined the fastenings. He did the same in Saunders' room and the bathroom. There were no doors between the 3 rooms, or he would have shut and locked them too. Now, Saunders, don't stay all night over your move. I've had time to smoke 1 cigarette already. It's bad to keep an invalid waiting. There's only one possible thing for you to do. What was that? The ivy blowing against the window. There, it's your move now, Eustace. It wasn't ivy, you idiot. It was someone tapping at the window. He pulled up the blind. On the outer side of the window, clinging to the sash, was the hand. What is it that it's holding? It's a pocket knife. It's going to try to open the window by pushing back the fastener with the blade. Well, let it try, said Eustace. Those fasteners screw down. They can't be opened that way. Anyhow, we'll close the shutters. It's your move, Saunders. I've played. But Saunders found it impossible to fix his attention on the game. He could not understand Eustace, who seemed all at once to have lost his fear. What do you say to some wine? He asked. You seem to be taking things coolly, but I don't mind confessing. I'm in a blessed funk. You've no need to be. There's nothing supernatural about that hand, Saunders. I mean, it seems to be governed by the laws of time and space. It's not the sort of thing that vanishes into thin air or slides through oaken doors, and since that's so, I defy it to get in here. We'll leave the place in the morning. I, for one, have bottomed the depths of fear. Fill your glass, man. The windows are all shuttered, the doors locked and bolted. Pledge me, my Uncle Adrian. Drink, man. What are you waiting for? Saunders was standing with his glass half raised. It can get in, he said hoarsely. It can get in. We've forgotten. There's a fireplace in my bedroom. It will come down the chimney. Quick, said Eustace as he rushed into the other room. We haven't a minute to lose. What can we do? Light the fire, Saunders. Give me a match, quick. They must all be in the other room. I'll get them. Hurry, man, for goodness sake. Look in the bookcase. Look in the bathroom. Here. Come and stand here. I'll look. Be quick, shouted Saunders. I hear something. Then plug a sheet from your bed up the chimney. No, here's a match. He had found one at last that had slipped into a crack in the floor. Is the fire laid? Good, but it may not burn. I know, the oil from the old reading lamp and this cotton wool. Now the match, quick! Pull the sheet away, you fool. We don't want it now. There was a great roar from the grate as the flames shot up. Saunders had a fraction of a second too late with the sheet. The oil had fallen onto it. It too was burning. The whole place will be on fire, cried Eustace as he tried to beat out the flames with the blanket. It's no good. I can't manage it. You must open the door, Saunders, and get help. Saunders ran to the door and fumbled with the bolts. The key was stiff in the lock. Hurry, shouted Eustace. The whole place is ablaze. The key turned in the lock at last. For half a second, Saunders stopped to look back. Afterwards, he could never be quite sure as to what he had seen, but at the time, he thought he saw something black and charred was creeping very slowly from the mass of flames toward Eustace Borlsover. For a moment, he thought of returning to his friend, but the noise and the smell of the burning sent him running down the passage, crying, Fire! Fire!
He rushed to the telephone to summon help, and then back to the bathroom. He should have done that before, for water. As he burst open the bedroom door, there was a scream of terror which ended suddenly, and then the sound of a heavy fall. The end. That was a lot more literal than I thought. The Beast with 5 Fingers by W.F. Harvey. That was wild. I did not think it was going to be a literal hand scuttling around, but I did like the tales of its misadventures in the big house, I have to say. I think that might be it for me tonight, guys, because I feel that my voice is kind of being strained by all the incessant reading. But thank you guys for joining me today. I hope it was cozy, even though the ghost stories were a little creepy. Also, welcoming Kai. Happy Halloween. Happy Halloween to you too. Let me take a quick look around, see if anyone is doing anything fun that we could go say hi to. Let's see. Who's doing anything? Oh, I see Iris is playing I'm on observation duty. Maybe we go say hi over there. Let's see. Anything else funky? Let's see. How long has Iris been going? Not too long. Let's go say hi to Iris playing I'm on Observation Duty 7. It's one of those games where you flip between different cameras and then you try to see if anything is out of place. And there are some creepy monsters, I suppose, but it's a fairly, like, laid-back horror game, I think. But first raid message is going to be for subscribers. Second raid message is going to be for everybody else. But I hope you all have a very excellent Halloween. Before we go, everyone make sure you do a big stretch. Make sure that you're an uncooked shrimp if you must be a shrimp. Make sure you get a sip of something. Doesn't matter what it is. Something is better than nothing. Make sure that if you need to go get food, please go get some food. If you need to sleep, please get lots of rest. Make sure that your jaw is nice and unclenched and your brows are not furrowed. As we head over there, we're gonna go say hello to Iris, see what they're up to, see how their observation duty is going. This is not a ASMR stream, so just an FYI, it will not be as quiet perhaps, but I'm gonna get this raid started. But as always, thank you guys so much for hanging out. Thanks for stopping in on this Halloween, and I hope you all have an excellent rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, and hopefully get to see you guys again very, very soon.